It's Hanukkah in a few days, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome back to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman, and Thinking Biblically is a podcast that is designed to help us apply all of Scripture to all of life. And before I introduce today's guest, don't forget to subscribe, like, review, share, all those wonderful things that will be a blessing to many people, we hope. As I'm sure our time today is going to be, I'm really excited about introducing to you a fairly new friend, Dr. Mark Kinzer. Mark is the moderator of Yachad BeYeshua, an international and interconfessional fellowship of Jewish believers in Yeshua, Jesus. It's a mouthful. Mark's going to explain what that is in a little bit. He is President Emeritus. I knew I was going to get that word wrong. Mark, I practiced. I even wrote it down with special symbols and things. I went blank. I'm not alone in this. You're still muted. Can you help us out with that word?
Emeritus.
Thank you. Emeritus. Mark is President Emeritus of the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute and Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Zera Avraham in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Mark is a leading Messianic Jewish theologian and one of the founders of the Society for Post-Supersessionists. I almost got it right. I know how to say that word too. Like Mark's into these big words, but don't worry, we're going to make what he says easy for everybody to understand. He is, I'm going to try it again, one of the founders of the Society of Post-Supersessionist Theology. How's that? Yeah, some people call that replacement theology. It's a lot easier to say. He's the author of several books, including Jerusalem Crucified, Jerusalem Risen, Searching Her Own Mystery, Israel's Messiah and the People of God, and Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. Shalom, Mark.
Shalom, Alan. Great to be with you.
I'm so glad you're able to do this. I don't know if you realize, you probably do. The way we met was because a mutual friend of ours put us in contact. That's the first time I heard about Yachad BeYeshua. And I found that intriguing, and maybe others will find it intriguing as well as you explain what that is. But the thing that really kind of connected me with you is you got to do something that I've been wanting to do, though I don't know if I have what it takes to do it in public. And that is, I watched your debate on YouTube with New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. And I think both of us have a great appreciation for N.T. Wright. I have found him to be so helpful in restoring I would call it the essential Jewishness of the gospel. And we could get easily sidetracked on that alone. And there's just so many things that Wright has discovered and has written about and spoken about that has been such a blessing, except you and I would agree that he doesn't have it quite right on on God's continuing plans and purposes for natural Israel. And you did your best. He wasn't yet convinced. And I still have a little dream that maybe he'd be willing to have a conversation with me. And because I have some things that I really want to say to him on this, because I actually believe that his inability to see the place of Israel on the plan of God actually undermines the other things that he's teaching, but he hasn't come to that realization yet. Should we be talking about him? Is that? I don't know. It's okay. If you're watching this, Tom, I'd be happy to have this conversation with you. So let us know. So why don't we start with you giving us a little bit of your own background and then explain what Yachad BeYeshua is, and then we're going to be talking about Hanukkah.
Okay. Well, yes. Well, I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. So I've grew up on the border of Canada, and so I feel like a part Canadian almost because I grew up with hockey night in Canada and curling and Canadian football and you know and Canadian
Bless
coins.
you, Mark. This is where I have to remind people that Detroit is one of those places where you have to go south, where you go south to Canada.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the only place. Exactly. That was a Trivial Pursuit question. It says, "Where is the only place in the United States where you can look south and see Canada?"
except as a Canadian, that's not trivial.
Yes.
So
So
continue.
yes, so I grew up in Detroit. My family are conservative Jews. My grandparents were all immigrants from Eastern Europe. My father was very involved in synagogue life, uh, and uh, and he and his brothers were the main leaders of our synagogue, which was the last residential synagogue in the city. And I grew up with a great deal of exposure to traditional Jewish life, but it was something that really did not appeal to me. I was a 20th century American kid growing up reaching my teenage years in the 1960s and being impacted by all of the cultural currents of the time. And so, while I knew something about Jewish life, it was not something that had captured my heart. I really didn't have faith at all. I didn't have faith uh, in the God of Israel. I didn't believe in Jesus. I just didn't believe. I was a secular person. And through a variety of different circumstances, a friend in high school, a 7-week trip through Europe, where I encountered many different people, and some books that I read, and my whole first year at the University of Michigan before that. Um, it put me in a place where I was open in a way that I never been before to possibilities that pure rationality was not capable of grasping some of the fundamental truths of life, and not capable of giving me a clarity of direction for how I should be living my life. And in the midst of all of this, flying home from Europe, reading a book that was given to me by a friend that was about God's work in the life of some teenagers who were drug addicts and how God had delivered them. I just I prayed and I said, God, if you are there, show yourself to me, and I want to know. And within the next couple of weeks after returning home, a variety of extraordinary things happened in my life, and that convinced me I had to move in this direction. And then my friend from high school introduced me to the man who would soon become my mentor. He was about 20 years my senior. He was a Jewish man raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, who basically lived his life not as a Christian. He lived his life as a follower of Jesus within the Jewish world. And the a bunch of these hippies who had come to faith in Jesus were drawn to him, in part because he was kind of a countercultural figure himself, even though he was 20 years older than them. And he couldn't get away from them. And so he became their teacher. And many of them were Jewish kids. And so I was brought into his orbit. And the Messianic Jewish movement hadn't really begun. It was really just in its infancy, let's just say, maybe in 1971. But he told me immediately. He said, "Go back to synagogue with your father. And he said, if you get married, marry a Jewish girl. And he said, don't become part of a church because you'll lose your Jewish identity if you become part of a church. And I took all of those things very seriously and went back to synagogue with my father. And now, with faith in the reality of the living God, suddenly the liturgy that I encountered in the synagogue which had been so dead to me before, was suddenly full of life when I read the translations of these prayers. They were so glorious and powerful. And so from that point on, in this very, it's a kind of paradox here, that really Jesus, Yeshua, brought me back to my Jewish identity. And so from that point on, I for almost 20 years, I was in a situation where there was no Messianic Jewish congregation. And so I was just attending a traditional synagogue in that context. And I was part of an ecumenical group of Christians. And so I was not part of a church, it was a charismatic community that was made up of people from all these different sort of traditions, including Messianic Jews. And then after about 20 years of that, we started a Messianic Jewish congregation, and that was in 1993. And since that time, I've been primarily working within the Messianic Jewish movement. Just one final point is, in the 90s, I went back to school and was able to finish my PhD at the University of Michigan in Second Temple Judaism. And so my work has also involved, to a great extent, academic work and trying to develop a serious Messianic Jewish theology.
Okay, so now could you explain what Yachad BeYeshua is?
Yes.
Because it's quite interesting that you're somebody, I think you're in the minority of Jewish believers that have gone the route that you've gone.
Yes.
Though interestingly, you also connected with other believers, non-Jewish believers, and
Yes.
outside of a Jewish context. And
Yes.
somewhere this thing about Yachad BeYeshua comes up. Can you explain what it is and
Yes.
and
Yes.
why?
Yes. So Yachad BeYeshua, it means together in Yeshua. And what it's and the very fact that it's in Hebrew is significant, because the idea is it is Jews who found a point of commonality and unity with one another because they're Jews and they're followers of Yeshua. And it may, to some people who are not Jewish or Jewish believers in Yeshua, it might seem obvious that Jewish believers in Jesus would be drawn to one another. But the reality is we tend to be a very kind of difficult crew in terms of getting along with one another and having strong relationships with one another and building unity together. And the tendency has been for us to become part of different churches or Messianic Jewish congregations, develop our own theologies, our own perspectives, and then to feel alienated from one another because we don't agree with one another on all of the details of doctrine. And in some ways, we've ended up in the world of Jewish believers in Jesus kind of replicating the divisions that exist among Christians as a whole. So the purpose of Yachad BeYeshua is really to try to bridge these divides and to be able to say, even if we don't share the same theologies, even if we're from different sort of either church or synagogue contexts and backgrounds, we've got something very powerful in common with one another. We're Jews and we're believers in Jesus, and there are not that many of us in the world. and that we need to find a way to come together across those differences and support one another, and bear witness both to God's faithfulness to Israel, and to the world in raising His Son Yeshua from the dead. This is in some ways I was in some ways I'm an odd person to work in this field, and in other ways, when I look at it, it fits perfectly. The reason it's odd is I've taken very strong positions on a number of doctrinal questions, which basically, I mean, when I wrote this book, Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism, it was a very strong argument, really, that Jews should be in Messianic Jewish congregations and should be very closely identified with the wider Jewish community. There were Jewish believers in Jesus who were part of the churches who felt like this Kinzer guy, he's he's a divisive figure, but the other part of me is I was part of an ecumenical community for 20 years of followers of Jesus, from of Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Baptists and Pentecostals, and even people from the Eastern Orthodox Church and Messianic Jews, and people who were simply non-denominational, and who were able to come together across those various differences without denying the reality of the differences, and still be able to say we need to find a way to love one another and support one another and bear witness to God and God's work together. And so for me, that's my heart. To have strong convictions about certain things and to not compromise. And this is not a unity that comes through compromise, but also to recognize that there's a hierarchy here. There are some things that are more important than other things, and on the things that are most important, actually, among the most important things is really love for one another, and for a Jewish follower of Yeshua, love for the Jewish people and other Jews, regardless of who they are and where they're at, and for a follower of Yeshua, love of the brethren in the Messiah. That's a sign, as First John says, of the fact that we belong to Him.
So to give a little bit of history and context about what's special about Yachad BeYeshua, is there have been, we call them Jewish, Christian, Hebrew Christian, Messianic Jewish fraternities for over 100 years. Jewish people, and some of the beginnings of that back in the 1800s was because if a Jewish person came to believe in Jesus, the Jewish community, which at that time would be such, because there wasn't the same social programs as our countries would eventually have, people would be cut off from social services and this sort of thing. And the church wasn't always very welcoming of Jewish believers. And so there was felt a need to have what back then they called Hebrew Christian fraternities. And so they've been going on in different forms through all these decades up till now. More recently, we have the emergence of the Messianic Congregations. And so these are fellowships of usually Jewish and non-Jewish believers in a worshiping the Lord in a Jewish cultural context. But something that Mark alluded to is a lot of those fellowships actually have very strong spiritual influences from the various factions of the broader Christian experience. So some are more Pentecostal and some are more Baptist, and on and on and on. And some of those theological divisions have actually caused tensions between Jewish believers. So it's been great that there have been these fraternities that have brought Jewish believers together. as well as then eventually we end up with actual congregations. Now, I think I'm still correct in thinking that most Jewish believers are not in Messianic congregations worldwide and by the sheer numbers.
Yes, that's for sure the case.
And so there's this theological and religious diversity among Jewish believers. Now, Yachad BeYeshua is different in a very unique way, and you alluded to it, in that most of these fraternities have been within the boundaries of the larger groupings of Christian tradition. So I understand there's an association of Hebrew Catholics, for example, and some of these other groups have been bringing together various Protestants. Now we have a brand new experiment, and it's not a completely new experiment to you because of your past experience, but for most of us, to try to have congeniality, a sense of brotherhood with Jewish believers from all the varieties of Protestantism, Messianic Judaism, and Catholic and Orthodox.
Yeah.
My mind and heart is blown. So we've been having these, there's these public webinars because this was getting launched right around when COVID happened. So we ended up with webinars like everybody's doing. And we've had these public, and then we had for members only webinars. And I'm not saying this because Mark doesn't know it, but the format is usually there's somebody with a story and somebody sharing something from history, some famous Jewish believer of some background. And I have to tell you, Mark, that we've had various ones doing their testimonies from all these various backgrounds, and being from where my theological leanings have been, I've not hung out with a lot of, or a few, no some, Jewish Catholics, and I never met Jewish or Orthodox. I'm not talking about Orthodox Jews, but Jewish Eastern Orthodox people. And these people are telling their stories, and all I could do is cry. The depth of the power of the Lord in these people's lives. Now, I would assume many of us are uncomfortable with some of the theological differences. But as you were just saying, to take the Lord's command to love seriously, this is I believe this is a magnificent experiment, and I hope it's an experiment that succeeds. And even the fact to allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable about some of these differences and yet understand that we have a commonality both in the Lord and in our Jewishness.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, that's been a powerful experience for me too. To meet some of these people for the first time. I still remember where in one of the earliest meetings that ultimately led to the birth of Yachad BeYeshua, there were a group of us meeting in Helsinki, Finland, and in part because it's on the border of Russia. And there were a number of these Jews from the Russian Orthodox Church who were from Russia itself who would come. And I was talking with this guy who was a Russian physicist and who was my age, and who his experience was so incredibly different from mine, and yet there was this connection, this soul connection that bypassed all of these incredible cultural differences and theological differences, and this sense that we belong together and could help one another. And so it was an experiential thing. It wasn't, it was, and so I've experienced the same kind of thing you described, very deeply moving to me. And I think nothing like this has ever happened. It's a grand experiment of the Holy Spirit. But I'm convinced that it's of tremendous importance, for the church and the Jewish people, that Jewish believers in Jesus are able to find a way to love one another and support one another. And I think it can be actually a sign to the people of God as a whole. If we can transcend some of these divisions, then the rest of the people of God can too.
Well, to think that when the Catholic Church split into the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, that's called the Great Schism, and now a bunch of Jewish believers are working not to do some of the other ecumenical type things that have done in the past, where my sense is it's often the lowest common denominator, or maybe somebody could share something from their own difference, but there is almost this prior commitment that we're not really going to bridge those gaps, not really. And yet here, these Jewish believers are talking, serious personal faith, and allowing each other, or putting themselves in that position where we're seeing each other as brothers and sisters. This is real serious stuff, and I'm touched by it. And I know there's going to be dips and turns and bumps along the way, but that's life. Yeah, so it's kind of a fascinating backdrop against which to talk about Hanukkah, because of the various cultural issues that have to do with this very happy festival. And so people can see, right, I have behind me what's called a Chanukiah. I grew up calling it a Hanukkah Menorah. There's a couple other things here too that I might explain as we go along with Mark's help. But why don't you take it away, Mark, and tell everybody what Hanukkah is?
Okay, well, the word Hanukkah means dedication, in the sense of a dedication of in this case a building, a dedication of the temple, and it refers to a rededication of the temple in the 2nd century BC, in the 160s BC, after the temple had been profaned by the presence of an idol there, an idol worship. And the story of how that happened is basically the story of Hanukkah, both the story of how the temple was defiled and then how the temple was retaken and reconsecrated to the worship of the God of Israel. That's the basis of the story. In order to understand that, one needs to see something about the overall history of the time. And Israel, the Jewish people lived under the rule of various empires after the destruction of the temple in 586 of the first temple, by the Babylonians. And so the Jews lived under the Babylonians, and then the Persians came. The Persian Empire came into power and overthrew the Babylonians, and allowed the Jewish people to return back to the land and to rebuild the temple. And then the Persian Empire was undone by a new empire, by Alexander the Great, and created a Hellenistic or Greek empire in the end of the 4th century BCE, and that particular empire involved the formation of a particular type of culture, which is often called Hellenism, and it's of tremendous importance for the whole future of Western civilization. So many of the institutions and things that we know, things like athletic games, like the Olympic Games, and and theater. All of this is something that comes from the Hellenistic culture. And so the Jews living in Jerusalem, living in the land of Israel, were able to govern their own affairs basically, but under the overall sovereignty of this empire. And it was a powerful cultural force. And it was one that really sought to homogenize things and to get the different groups, different nations, different ethnicities that were within this large empire to take on the Hellenistic way of life and the Hellenistic worldview. And many Jews were willing to do this in a variety of different ways. And for some, it was they looked at it and they said, there's some good things here. We can learn from this. And they found a way to synthesize the Jewish tradition with the good things that they saw in the Hellenistic culture. And of course, there were others who simply fled from it and said, "There's nothing good in this." And then there were others who looked at it and said, "This is the real thing. It's so much better than anything we've had before, and we really need to do is simply absorb this wonderful Hellenistic culture and in effect replace our own Jewish customs." And so in the 2nd century BCE, there were some of these Jews in Jerusalem who that's what they did. They came into power and they took over the temple and they began to Hellenize it. And this led really to something like a civil war. And then the emperor of that particular period that was overruling and sovereign in the land sided, of course, with the group that was trying to Hellenize things. And he came in and made war against the Jews who were trying to protect and preserve the traditional Jewish way of life. And so this war that began as a civil war suddenly then became a war between Jews who wanted to preserve the basics of Jewish life, even if they saw some good in Hellenism, but they wanted to continue to circumcise their sons. They wanted to continue to study the Torah and have it be the basic constitution of Jewish life. They wanted to continue to keep the dietary laws that were basic to Jewish life. They wanted to continue to have the temple worship function the way in which it always had done, and not have idolatrous worship within the temple. Pretty basic, I would say. They were opposed to Jewish men parading naked in the gymnasium and basically engaging in athletic contests in the nude. This conflict ultimately led to the Greek Empire taking control of the temple and basically establishing an idol there. And then under a particular family of priests who were known as the Maccabees, in a really amazing way, this family was able to make war, gather the faithful Jews, make war against those Jews who were wanting to totally assimilate, and towards this emperor, and they were able to win a victory and overthrow them, and then rededicate the temple to the God of Israel and to the worship, the religious life of the Jewish people. And so these issues of one of the reasons it's so relevant to our life today, both as Jews and as Christians, is we also live in a culture that presses us into conformity in various ways, which easily leads to the breaking down of the distinctives of our particular way of life. And again, we end up with the same kind of variety of reactions among us that you saw among the Jewish people in the second century, with some basically saying, there's some good here and we can learn some things, but we need to be faithful to our tradition and create, take the good and not take everything from this very powerful culture that we're in. There are others who basically then say we can't take anything. We have to just circle the wagons and basically cut ourselves off from that culture. And there are others who say no. Basically, everything about Jewish life and Christian life in the past needs to be reinvented to conform to the standards of our culture. And so we've got the same kind of challenges that the Jewish people had in that second century. And I think it's worth our praying that we have that leaders emerge among us who are able to guide us through it as successfully as the Jewish people had in the second century.
Yeah, and would you agree? So what, in the case of the story of Hanukkah, the enough is enough moment came because the Greek establishment had really gone too far. I believe they had forbid the study of Torah.
Yes.
I haven't looked it up. I don't want to get into it, but I've read more than once that Jewish men began to hide their circumcision. Yes. I don't know how you do that, but
it's a surgical procedure. It's a painful surgical procedure.
I imagine it would be.
Yeah, because you would need to do that, because if you were entering fully into this kind of Hellenistic, this Greek way of life, you would participate in the nude in certain athletic competitions, and so it would become clear whether you were following the Jewish tradition of circumcision or not.
Yeah, so you end up in a society where you need to hide your distinctive in order to participate in the larger culture.
Yes.
In that case, that erupted in a revolt begun by a man by name Mattatyahu, and then when he died, taken over by his son Judah, as you said, and they were known as the Maccabees. So when they rededicated the temple, they celebrated a feast, and that's what we're still doing today. What's your thought on why the 8 days?
Yeah.
Why is it an 8-day feast?
Yeah. Well, the 8 days it seems to go back to the 8-day holiday of Sukkot. The holiday of Sukkot is it's also known as the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. It takes place always in the fall, usually in September or October, and it's this 8-day celebration of the harvest in the fall, and it's a tremendously celebrative event. It's kind of the climax of all of these beautiful holidays in the Jewish calendar, in the seventh month of the Jewish calendar, or the first month, depending on how you're calculating it. Rosh Hashanah, the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, when in this period of the Civil War, there was a several-year period where the temple had been taken over by the faction of both Jews and Greeks who defiled it with an idolatrous worship, and they were unable to observe the Feast of Sukkot in the temple, and so the temple had been recaptured, and they were ready to have a rededication. And it was like just a few months, 2 or 3 months after, they would have celebrated Sukkot. And so it seems like the 8 days of dedication were in part modeled on that. There was also 8 days of dedication of the temple, in of the other temples in the Solomon's temple, and there was a similar kind of dedication of the tabernacle. So the number 8 seems to be also very much connected with this idea of dedication. But I think Sukkot is a key part of it, because one of the other themes of Sukkot is light, and it was remembering the kavod, the glory of God, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud that rested on the tabernacle in the wilderness, and also rested on the temple when it was established by Solomon. And so in the holidays of Sukkot, in the temple, the celebration was very much associated with light. And that's why, in the Gospel of John, when it's during the holiday of Sukkot, of Tabernacles, when Yeshua says, I'm the light of the world, because the temple was lit up brilliantly during that time with torches. And so, in this particular time, in the middle of the winter, when we reach the darkest time of the year, to say we're going to have a dedication of the temple. It's going to be modeled in some ways on Sukkot, and we're going to take that theme of light, and it'll have even more power for us now, because it's in the midst of the darkness, and then that symbolism of light emerging out of the deepest darkness, the deepest darkness of Jewish existence, with the temple being defiled in this way and looking like Judaism had simply been destroyed, and suddenly God acts and there's victory, and it's like light emerging in the midst of the darkness. And so that the lighting of candles, the theme of light, often this is called the Festival of Lights, and I think that's it's the most beautiful part, really, of the holiday. Of course, there's also a tradition that emerged. I expect you were going to ask me about it at some point.
I was. Want to hold off on that, though?
Yeah, okay.
So, we're talking about the Festival of Lights. So
yes.
Over here, I have my Hanukkah. I actually have several of them. And people often notice, they know there's 8 days of Hanukkah, and they notice that there's 9 candles, or a lot of people now are using different varieties of oil lamps, which are very cool. But anyway, so this is a candle type. And the reason why there's 9 branches to the candelabra is it's said that the purpose of the Hanukkah is to tell the miracle of Hanukkah, and it's not supposed to have any other function. And we'll get to the miracle in a moment, as I was saying. And so there's a 9th candle called the Chamesh, which means servant, and it lights all the other candles. And for those who aren't familiar, on the first night of Hanukkah, which this year is Sunday, November the 28th, it's coming up soon. The first night we light the one candle, and plus the Chamesh. You light the Chamesh lights the one candle, it burns all the way down. And then the next day you light 2 candles until the 8th night. We light all 8. There's another symbol that speaks about the miracle, and it's a children's game played with in Yiddish. We call this a dreidel. You see there's Hebrew letters on it. It's a spinning top. This is actually very difficult to spin because it's so big, but I'm using it so you can see it. In Hebrew, it's called a savivon, which means a turning thing. And so I'm actually going to try it on camera here. I have a smaller one, and let's see. Can you do this the first time? Here we go. Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
And so there are games that are played with it. Years ago, I was working in a community center, and I had the kids play battling dreidels. So there's various things you could do with this. Just don't throw them at your sister. Okay. Now, on the dreidel, I'll get the big one again. The 4 letters I'm not trying to steal the show from you, Mark. We're going to come back to you in a second.
That's okay. I was going to ask you the question. What are the 4 letters, Alan, on the dreidel?
Well, they are 4 letters that stand for 4 Hebrew words that make a sentence. The 4 letters are Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin. And it stands for Nes Gadol Haya Sham, which means a great miracle happened there. And so it reminds us again that a great miracle happened in the land of Israel at this time of year. But these dreidels come with a problem, because you can't play with these in the land of Israel because of a great miracle. And this probably emerged outside the land of Israel much later. And so a great miracle happened there in the land of Israel. And so they make a different kind of dreidel that you use in Israel. And I have one. This is called a po dreidel. Instead of Nes Gadol Haya Sham, it's Nes Gadol Haya Po. A great miracle happened here. So I bought this in Israel. I wondered when I came back on the airplane if the last letter would mysteriously change, because this is logical impossibility. But just so you know, I'm kidding. But I always wanted one of these, and I have one. Actually, I have more than one. So the miracle. What is the miracle of Hanukkah, Mark? And I hope, maybe we're going to get into a little bit of an argument here, make it a little more fun. So we'll see what happens. What's the miracle? Oh, and I'm prepared, by the way.
I'm sure you are.
I'm prepared.
Yes. Well, in the earliest sources that we have about the story of Hanukkah are the books of Maccabees. And there are 4, there's a first Maccabees, second Maccabees, third Maccabees, fourth Maccabees. And these are all books that come from the first couple of centuries after the events that's being described. I mean, the first Maccabees, written within the first 100 years, and they, for them, this is also a miracle, but the miracle is the fact that a handful of faithful Jews were able to overcome an empire, a vast army, and that was the experience of the miracle, and that's really the main sense you get from these early sources. But in the Talmud, the Talmud are Jewish texts that are sets of traditions that really accumulate from the 1st century on to the 6th century, 7th century, written and there another tradition emerges that most Jews would say is a legend rather than historical, just because it's not found in any of the earliest sources. But it's a beautiful story, and it's almost a kind of parable or a symbolic representation of what was happening in the story itself. This tale says that when the Jewish people took the temple back, of course there is a menorah, the menorah in the temple, which is a 7-branched rather than a 9-branched candelabra. There you go. That's more a picture of the menorah that was in the temple itself. And there was special oil that was used to light the fires on the menorah. And that oil had to be couldn't have had contact with idolatrous worship or with any unclean animal products or anything of that sort. And according to this tradition, when they took the temple back, they found oil, but there was only oil enough to light the menorah for one day. And they needed more time to reconsecrate oil in order to be able to use it. And so they didn't know what they were going to do, but they took the oil they had, and they lit the menorah, and the oil, which really only should have lasted for one day, actually lasted for 8 days, enough time for them to be able to consecrate new batches of oil. And so this is very similar to miracles we have in the Bible, like in stories of Elijah and Elisha. There's one particular one where oil gets multiplied, or we can think about this story of Yeshua and the multiplications of the loaf and the fish. And so there's this idea of a miracle of God taking a little bit and making it go much further. But here it's then also connected with light. And in the time of the midst of the darkness, they take the little bit of oil they have, and it burns beyond its natural capacities, and the light is preserved in the midst of the darkness.
Yeah,
and that's my spiel. So
so that's the story.
Tell me the real story.
You covered everything, almost everything. This is the story that's always told. It's in every kid's book about Hanukkah. It's the focus. It's the reason why oil plays such a central part. It's the reason why we eat latkes, potato pancakes. Do you prefer applesauce or sour cream with yours?
I'm an applesauce guy.
Me too.
My wife and her mother, they're sour cream people, but I'm a devoted applesauce and potato latkes.
But the applesauce folks can love the sour cream folks.
We live together and love one another.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really amazing.
Just don't get any of your sour cream on my line.
Yeah, I can hardly look at the sour cream, but still, I could love those people. And I could even serve it to them because I appreciate that.
That's right.
So Mark at the beginning referred to his ancestors coming from Eastern Europe, same thing as me and my wife, and we're part of a large cultural Jewish group called the Ashkenazi Jews, and we eat latkes at Passover time. At Hanukkah. And then another large cultural Jewish group are the Sephardi Jews, and they eat jelly donuts. Zivganiot, it's called. Also, they're cooked in oil. Again, the oil theme has taken over the sentiment of Hanukkah. But as you said, Mark, it does appear that the 8 days comes from Sukkot. The lights also come from Sukkot. And there is no early mention of the oil. I don't know if we have time to get into it. Are you aware of the controversy about rabbinical feelings towards the descendants of the Maccabees?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is the Maccabees in general do not get much good press among the within the rabbinic tradition in the Talmudic sources, and in part, there was a concern about the kind of militarist development that occurred within the Maccabees, and there, part of the problem was, you had the destruction of the temple in 70. And it was zealots who were leading the charge against the Romans, who identified a lot with the Maccabees. And then 60 years later, you have Bar Kokhba and another revolt against Rome, and even a more terrible destruction that comes to Jerusalem as a result of that. And again, that there was this identification with zealots and with the Maccabees, and the rabbinic tradition really emerges in that post Bar Kokhba period in the 2nd century and afterwards, and partly in reaction to militaristic types of messianic movements. I think there was this desire to kind of distance themselves from the Maccabees and put less emphasis on a kind of militaristic miracle, and to spiritualize it in a sense a bit, and to focus more on a kind of the spirit, the supernatural message of God's action, rather than purely human action. So that's my understanding. I don't know if you have anything you can add, or
didn't the Maccabees and their leadership lead to corruption among the Kohanim, the priestly class, as well?
Yes. This is, the Maccabees started off, made a good start, but one of the interesting things is they actually were not part of the set of Jews who were wanting to completely reject everything Hellenistic. They were not. They were among those who were trying to find a middle way, and they wanted to preserve the tradition, the fundamentals of the tradition. But they were open to certain elements of the Greek culture. And after they had established a dynasty, in many ways they took on some of the bad elements of the empires around them, and so there was a good bit of corruption, and eventually it leads to the Romans coming in and getting rid of the Maccabean dynasty.
Wasn't King Herod himself a descendant of that family group?
No, he wasn't. Of the Maccabees, you mean?
Of the Maccabees. Maccabees to the
He had a wife. He had a wife who was from the Maccabean dynasty, Marianna. I don't know that his mother was. I don't think he. And
that might be right. That might be right.
And his father was, his father, and I'm not sure about his mother, but were Idumeans. But he did have a wife who was from that dynasty.
So we basically used our time, and you did refer to this. We've talked a bit about the assimilation, and you really brought out well, Mark, the tension of those who embrace the whole culture and want to replace the existing one. In this case, of course, would be God's word, a culture formed by God's word. But then you had the people of middle position. Is there can we close out with some sort of lesson for us today from these tensions?
Yes. Well, I think that, I think the critical lesson is our getting clear on what the fundamentals are that can't be compromised. This is maybe going back to some of the early discussions we had. There are some things about our faith and about our way of life that they need to be non-negotiables. And I think in that period in the 2nd century, there was a coalition of Jews who, even though they differed on lots of things, they had a clear sense of there were certain fundamentals, of the text of the Torah, circumcising your sons, being able to observe the Sabbath and the holidays, and just keep distinct Jewish identity and keep idols out of the temple, that there was that sense of these are non-negotiable items to Jewish identity. And I think followers of Yeshua in our own culture, we have to get clear, what are the non-negotiables for us? There have to be some clear non-negotiables. As much as the culture presses upon us, these are things that cannot be, we can't compromise on them. At the same time, everything can't be non-negotiable, and we have to get clear on what are the majors and what are the minors, and I think so that we can't go the way of the Essenes either, who simply retreat to the desert. and cut themselves off, basically, even from the rest of the Jews, in order to have absolute purity, you know? And we live in this culture. We have to find a way to be ourselves and to be true to who we are. And at the same time, to also be open that there are some good things here. Everything is not bad. And, it's not, everything is not evil. And that we have to find a way to connect with other people around us who don't share even the commitment to the non-negotiables we had. One of the things that was positive about Hellenism was it had a universal dimension. It had this sense of everybody, in a sense, there's like one, the world as a whole is made up of human beings who are all actually one thing, one reality, the human race. And the tendency before that was for everybody to have a sense of just, we're our own, we're totally separate, well, it's the same in our situation today. We have to be able to embrace who we are as Jews, as Christians, as Americans, as Canadians, as whatever. And at the same time, to be open to learn and to be connections, even with those people who are different than we are. So I think the lessons are to learn both of these things, and to not simply become, the Dead Sea community, but also to not go the way of the assimilationists who simply were willing to go along with everything that was happening in the culture around them. It's more difficult to take that road where you're living within the world and not of that world. That's, I think, the calling we have.
That's actually such a something that is so well developed in the New Covenant writings, the New Testament, where we have the Jewish Messiah comes, trains these Jewish men to go into the prevailing non-Jewish culture with the truth of the one true God, not compromising, but allowing that truth to find its way into these other cultures without turning them into Jewish enclaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fascinating, actually, especially when we understand that what they were really coming up against. Like we think of, it was such a successful mission, but actually, to think you had these Jewish men who grew up in a more or less a closed Jewish environment, and even Paul was more cosmopolitan, but even then, and to work out how the truth of the one true God was going to pervade the rest of the diverse world. It's really, really something.
Yeah.
And so then we have the opportunity to know the Chamesh of God, the servant of God, who's the light of the world, who lights us up, that we might be the light of the world, so that we could be like a Hanukkah to the whole world. And as we know, we talk about distinction, the light doesn't compromise. But we have a hard time in knowing what things we can adopt, what things aren't a big deal, and what things we have to stand against. But when it comes to standing against what we have to stand against, it could cost us our lives. Well, Mark, thank you so much for doing this. It'd be wonderful. There's some other things that we were talking about before we came on that I would love to explore with you. And if you're open, I'd love to have you back. You don't have to make a commitment now, but we'll be in touch. But thank you so much for doing this with me today.
It's my pleasure, Alan.
Before you go, what's the best way for people, if they want to get to know your books or get to know you better, what's the best way for them to do that?
I do have a website, markkinzer.com. So, MarkKinzer. And
that's Zed for you Canadians out there.
That's, yes, thank you.
I'm bilingual. Yeah. So markkinzer.com, I will list it in the description so you can access it there. Of course, if you have any questions for me, you can email me at comments at always Torah Bites tends to be on my mind. Don't forget to check out torahbites.org. But this is Thinking Biblically. So it's comments at thinkingbiblically.org. Mark, again, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So again, you can contact Mark at markkinzer.com. The link will be down below in the description. Don't forget to comment and share and subscribe. And again, you can email me at comments@thinkingbiblically.org. And so until next time, happy Hanukkah. This is Alan Gilman with Thinking Biblically.